Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we are turning our attention to East Asia and the origins of the 14-year struggle between Japan and China that some say marked the real start of the Second World War. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again. Another week, another podcast. So this time, as I've just said, we're moving to, well, I would say the East, depending where you are from. If you're sitting in listening or seeing this in the US, you might say you're going west. But basically, we're going to, what's the right word? The other end of the world, for a better term.
Indeed.
Because, well, dear listeners, dear viewers, as you know, well, our podcast is called Both Sides of the Wire, World War II. I think it's fair to say that both Jesse, you and I, we are more experts on the European theatre of war. And a number of people have commented on this as well, that we have concentrated very much on the European theatre. And we had another poll, and our members could say, well, what is it that you would like us to talk about? And if I'm not mistaken, well, China, Japan, the build-up to the war between these two nations, well, topped this particular poll. And so we are dealing with this one in this episode. And let's see, as always, how many episodes we can fill with this, because we always say it's going to be one or two, and then we end up with many more. And I would say, as always, where do we go? So we could start in 1937, we could start in 1931. Are we going to take it further back and, as always, set the scene and provide some context? I think that's what we need to do. And, well, our valued listeners and viewers will know that this is what we always do, which is brilliant because it also gives us lots of opportunities to find rabbit holes and tangents. There we are. Jesse, where do we start?
All right, this is going to be a series filled with epic rabbit holes, I'm sure. And one of the reasons is because I want to take us way back for a mega context, a super deep context here for this clash between China and Japan that kind of lasts from 37 to 45, kind of lasts from 31 to 45, but actually the roots go much, much further back, and I think all of that is relevant. Before we jump into that, though, I just want to say, I want to re-emphasize the point you made, Matthias, that one of the reasons why we're going to dedicate so much time to this topic is because it was one that was chosen by our podcast supporters. So if you listening or watching out there want to also have a say and get a vote in what kinds of topics we cover here on the podcast, you can also become a supporter. And you can do that by going to our website, bothsidesofthewire.com, and there joining our supporter community. So, without further ado, let us begin the story in the 19th century. The century that is kind of the origin of everything. A lot of the stuff that we talk about in different ways. Almost everything in the modern world. Now, that's obviously an exaggeration, but still. All right. Let's start with China, shall we? Let's start with China. The 19th century is not kind to China. It goes through a very, very difficult period. Essentially, this period is sometimes called a century of humiliation for China, going from around the middle of the 19th century to about the Second World War. Is sometimes considered one of the most difficult periods in Chinese history, and it's not hard to understand why when we get into it. So China is a declining, one could even say maybe partly stagnant, weakening power. It was an absolute cultural and economic and military powerhouse for centuries before this, but it doesn't have an industrial revolution, and therefore it has internal problems as well of bureaucracy and political infighting, all those sorts of things, economic issues. But the big problem is when industrialized powers start interacting with China. And that happens in the middle of the 19th century. The British arrive, the French arrive, the Portuguese arrive before them. But the real clash where they start imposing their will on China is in the middle of the 19th century. You have the infamous Opium Wars, where the British and the French, there are two Opium Wars, I guess, where they eventually end up telling the Chinese government, here's what your economic policy should be. You should allow us to trade this and that. Drugs that you don't want, you have to buy them. And they burn part of Beijing. They even burn the Forbidden Palace and massacre all sorts of people. It's an awful event, especially from a Chinese point of view. It's essentially conquest by foreign powers, which had never really happened in that form. Of course, the Chinese were being ruled by non-ethnic Chinese at the time, Manchus, but the state had never suffered in recent memory this kind of a disaster to these industrialized powers. Russia also then grabs a bunch of territory from China in the north. They take advantage of the situation with China losing the Opium Wars and basically force them to diplomatically give up huge swaths of territory. Then you also have the Europeans who are impinging on Chinese sovereignty. They take territories or force the Chinese to agree to leases of territory, like Hong Kong being probably the most famous one, but also the Germans take some territory as well at Tsingtao. There are others. And then there's this general economic unbalance, let's say, these unfair or unequal treaties that most of the Western powers and the Russians and the United States eventually force the Chinese to sign, which gives them economic advantages, gives them control over a lot of economic infrastructure in China, like factories, mines, railways. They get preferential treatment for trade deals. These are all kind of called concessions, economic concessions, and unequal treatings. And you have, in cities, you have quarters of the city that are essentially not under Chinese control. Most famously, I guess, in Shanghai, where you have a foreign quarter there. And they're running the show. They've got their own police officers there. The British have like Indian police troops there for their quarter and all sorts of stuff like this. So this is kind of the situation that China finds itself in on the eve of the 20th century. It gets worse for them at the very end of the 19th century and start of the 20th century. But I will turn it over to Matthias now to continue this very sad story of what happens in China and to China in the long lead up to the Second World War.
It is a very long lead up, isn't it? But it's also interesting because quite often people say that the Chinese, even today, they tend to think long term, which is very interesting, very different, a very different view from what we in the West see. Because we tend to think, particularly if you're a politician these days, you tend to think in 4 to 5 year cycles because that's when the next election is due. And generally speaking, from a cultural point, you might say the Chinese see this slightly differently. And yes, the 19th century really, as you've explained, is not a good century. Here you have a power which sees itself as the center of the earth for centuries, and says, well, we are really the leading ones. But then, of course, as you explained, they cut their ties, they become isolationist, look inward rather than outward. You have some of these colonial powers coming in. You mentioned them all, starting, for example, also with the Portuguese that you mentioned there. And everything that you said, really, really difficult. Then you've got this forceful opening by the Western states who now have modern guns, modern boats, modern ships, different armies because, and again, you used the word industrialization, and of course, the Chinese do not have this. And so you've got the struggle with the European powers, but you also now get the first struggle with another Asian power, and that, of course, is Japan. And if you want to understand what goes on in China, you need to look a little bit to Japan as well. We did another episode on this where we talked in particular about Manchuria in 1941, the outbreak of the war between Japan and the US. And it's all related. You can't really just look at one of these nations without looking at the others, or the others, you might say. So what's happening in Japan at the same time? So it's a relatively similar story, you might say, to what happens in China. So Japan also decides that they're not going to have a lot of contact with the outside world, so they cut their ties. They're quite happy to be isolationist, to maintain the very traditional social and cultural and economic structures back home, similar to what you then find in China in the 19th century. There is a forceful opening because Western forces arrive, and they basically, to use the Clausewitzian term, impose their will on Japan and say, okay, you know what, you're going to open now, you're going to buy our goods, all these things. So you might say quite similar to what is happening to, with, and in China. But there's one fundamental difference that you find here. Whereas the Chinese kind of reject all of these ideas. We come back to that in a minute when we talk, for example, about the Boxer uprising and the rebellion. And they say, no, we want to be traditional. We want to have our Chinese way of life. And why wouldn't you? The Japanese are a bit different. And the Japanese open up society and open up industry and open up in particular the military. Well, to a certain degree. So they're still trying to maintain the old social structures and things like this. However, particularly in the military world, and also to a degree economically, they realize that what the West is imposing, I wouldn't say offering, is imposing, is actually the way forward. And so they start a very, very quick, very, very deep, very thorough process of realigning. Particularly that comes out in the military. So they start to modernize the military. And while they're doing this, they're then beginning to look to other areas, because you do this, you're beginning now to change the industry, you're beginning to build up a bigger military, you're now beginning to think that it might be an idea to expand into Asia yourself. And sooner or later, this is going to lead to clashes, obviously, with China, because when you look at the map, it's just there, isn't it? And the first time where these two nations now really clash is in 1894 during the First Sino-Japanese War. And this war is really over control of Korea. So Korea is a key player in this relationship. Korea is not formally part of China at a particular time, but it's basically controlled by China. Let's not get into all the details here, because otherwise that would take
state
forever.
Of some kind.
Something like that, exactly. And so in July 1894, the Japanese then decide to basically go to war, because they are now spreading their wings. They're trying to get more control. And it's a war that, basically it's a military campaign of around about 6 months. Officially, the war goes on from July 1894 to April 95. And the fighting itself, the numbers, when you look at them, are when you're looking at the beginning, quite small. You're looking at several thousand troops. It's not a massively big involvement of troops. It gets a bit bigger as the war continues. In the end, it's a stunning victory for the Japanese, and they've been able to defeat the Chinese, who now cede this territory to Japan. That also includes other parts. For example, modern-day Taiwan also comes under Japanese control. So this is the first time that the Japanese have now moved off their island and have established a stronghold, a foothold on Asian mainland. And that's interesting, because in their understanding, also if we fast forward, for example, for a minute and go to World War II, Korea is kind of seen as mainland Japan. It's a little bit like Algeria for the French. So it's not just an overseas territory, it's a bit more. You can see this, again, if you jump forward for 1 minute into World War II, that they're actually drafting people from Korea into the Japanese army. About 200,000 Koreans get drafted into the Japanese army. So you can see it's the beginning of an interesting change in the political reality on the ground. And just like the Chinese have been forced to open their territory by the Europeans, and to a lesser degree at that stage, perhaps the US, you now get the same from the Japanese. And of course, this is only just the beginning of this relationship that you find. And more is happening in China before we actually hit the 1930s and then World War II. So Jesse, what's the next step? Where do we need to go from here?
Well, I wanted to also say a few words about this war between Japan and China in 1894-95, because it is, I think, a turning point, if you will. That's a bit of a sometimes questionable concept in history, but it is quite impactful. And I think one of the reasons is it is the start of this process of Japan being able to take over Korea. They don't fully colonize Korea until later in 1910, formally, but the Sino-Japanese War gives them a new status, right? And you can see this process of northeastern East Asia, so Korea and Manchuria, becoming a huge security problem and an imperial objective for China, for Japan, and also for Russia. Russia is a bit of a wild card in here because they now have a border with Korea after they forcibly were given this extra territory by China in the 19th century. So Japan, one of the reasons why it decides to attack Chinese forces to get more influence over Korea is that they're worried about Russian imperial expansion in East Asia. Russia's building the Trans-Siberian Railway in the 1890s, and this will allow them to project more power in the region. And it's one of those factors that causes Japan to, let's say, accelerate its imperial ambitions, or as some of the Japanese would see it, its security concerns become heightened. And Manchuria is home to quite a few different railways that are important, and they will play a role in the 20th century in several different conflicts, including the Second World War. I also wanted to add another note of context about these developments in general in China and Japan. Obviously, they're more complex than what we can get into on this podcast today. But the Chinese, they are also, at the same time as they're struggling with being defeated by foreign powers, not being able to modernize, there are some in the Chinese elite who are trying to achieve that. They just fail. So there are efforts. There's a so-called self-strengthening movement that's influential in many Chinese circles. They try to modernize their military. At least some of the regional governors try to use Western ideas for their local armies, because there isn't really one whole China-wide imperial army at that time in the late 19th century. They try to buy a couple of modern warships for their fleet, and they do have 2 big warships going into the war with Japan. Unfortunately, you need more than hardware to effectively use the tools of industrial war. It's a cultural thing, it's an organizational thing, it's a logistical thing, it's a bureaucratic thing to wage war with a modern army. And China is not able to accomplish that. And it's one of the reasons why the Japanese beat them, is because the Japanese do accomplish that. Although for them, there are also problems with this modernization. There's cultural resistance. The authorities have to walk back some of the cultural westernization that they wanted to implement at first, about dress and haircuts and things like that. Conservative forces forced them to retreat on that. A lot of farmers are very angry in China because for this new industrialized military, farmers in Japan are angry because they are taxed more in order to fund this new modern military. So not everyone is benefiting. Not everyone is going in the same direction in the two countries, which I think is quite interesting. And then you have the first kind of culmination of this, which is this new Japanese empire that's been modernizing so at such a breakneck pace, defeats China. And this was not necessarily what outside observers expected. It's not what the Chinese expected. It's not even what all the Japanese expected at the beginning of that first Sino-Japanese war in the 1890s. So what comes out of that is an even further weakened China and a strengthened, invigorated, let's say, although that's also a questionable term to apply to a nation or a state, but an invigorated, confident Japan that now has partly displaced China in Korea in terms of influence, and there can't be reforms in Korea without Japan agreeing to it and all this kind of stuff. So fast forward a couple of years, and we have our next kind of clash that changes or influences the balance of power in this region. And that is what we call normally in the West the Boxer Uprising in China. Because of this influence of Western powers, a lot of people in China are unhappy. They're unhappy with the government that's not able to protect China's sovereignty, not able to protect them from economic domination by foreigners. And it's also cultural, because with Western economic influence, you start to have cultural influence. And one of the elements of that is Christian missionaries. So you have missionaries spreading out into different parts of China, trying to convert people, and they do convert, not anywhere near, the majority of the population, but they convert a number of Chinese, and they build churches. And that starts to have an impact on what your city looks like, what relations are like between neighbors. And the Westerners, the Western churchmen and missions, and then the Chinese converts, they have advantages in Chinese society, for example, in the legal system. So you'll have Western missionaries, protecting Chinese converts in legal disputes with non-Christian Chinese, and it just creates huge amounts of resentment, huge amounts of potential conflict. And because the Chinese state is so weak and not able to run the country essentially and protect the country, you have groups in society start organizing themselves in the form often of secret societies. And they develop their own kind of pseudo-religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs of different kinds. They organize themselves kind of maybe partly militarily a little bit sometimes. And one of the group that becomes the most famous are who we call the Boxers. I think it's the Society of Righteous Fists or something like that is an approximate Mandarin translation. To cut a long story short, they are not fans of Western influence and not fans of the Chinese government, which is unable to do its job. So they essentially start an uprising against Westerners and Christians and against the Chinese government. And that becomes the Boxer Uprising, which the Chinese government is hard-pressed to put down. And I'll throw it over to you, Matthias, because I don't want to steal all the thunder of the Boxer Uprising story from you here. So,
the Boxer Uprising, and again, it's not a term that I think in research is being used these days. Use a different term, but it's a term that's still commonly and widely used. So let's just stick with this particular term. It is an absolutely fascinating story, and also I would say it defines not only the relationship between China, Japan, China, and other countries for quite some time, but there are other far-reaching consequences. I mean, like, for example, we can talk about this in a minute, the German emperor's speech about the Huns. I mean, that's where the term comes from. That's why the Germans are being called the Huns, but in the English-speaking world. So you can see all sorts of interesting links here. And you've already set the scene. I mean, this is exactly what's happening. So we continue the story that we've already put out there. So China is weakened. China's actually lost the war against Japan. You've got these tensions within China, not a centralized government, different groups, different factions, whether it's in different parts of the country, whether it's at the court where the queen is basically torn between all these different factions. Again, we need about 15 hours just to really get into this when we talk about the Boxer Uprising. So maybe we park that thought there. But what you do get is it's in the term. It's an uprising. It really starts when, for the reasons that you explained, Christian missionaries are being attacked. There's a German envoy that is assassinated. Actually, from my hometown, Münster, he's now buried in the main cemetery in Münster. That's where he is, and all this starts the uprising, but also then, of course, the counter-reaction. Because you do have this forced opening of China by the Western forces and by the Western nations. They all have their little settlements, their trading posts, and what have you in China. And these, of course, are now getting attacked by the Chinese. The most famous one is in Beijing. There's a film, The 55 Days of Beijing. I think it was made in the 60s, I'm guessing. It's the famous episode where in the Western quarter, so to speak, while these guys prepare for the siege, They are besieged, and then all sorts of things happen. And in the end, of course, they are relieved, and that's seen as this big symbol of the dominance, of the victorious. Let's call them Western powers. Western powers are actually not quite right, because what you do find here is that not only do you have Western powers, but you also have Japan involved. Because Japan and Russia. And so when we stick with Japan for a moment, again, we might say, well, how do they fit in? Well, it's because of this tension that we've already talked about. They're beginning to expand. And in some ways, even though, of course, you might say it's a different culture, it's definitely not a Christian culture, but at least from a military point of view, they are now being structured along European lines. Again, go back to this forced opening in the 1860s, early 1870s, the very rapid restructuring and reforms that Japan sees. They first of all get 2 French delegations in to reform their army along French lines. Then they drop the French and get the Germans in, probably a consequence of not least the 1870-71 war. It's the time where the Prussian/German military army, not the navy, just the army, is seen as the role model. So they bring these guys in and reorganize the army basically along the German structure. So we've got 6 military districts in Japan. Each of that has a division. They've got on paper, at least on paper, they've got full conscription. The structure that they have is that of a square division, so 2 brigades with 2 regiments, which is a very standard European structure at that particular time. So in inverted commas, in some ways, you could just include the Japanese when you say Western. I know it's a bit more difficult, but at least from a military point of view. And of course, you already mentioned you've got Russia as well. So another, let's call it European power, at least in the structure. And other nations involved. So you've got, of course, the British there, you've got the Americans there. You have the Germans there as well. For the Germans, this is in some ways a bit of a watershed in many ways. It's the first time, you might say, that the Germans really sent out troops to do real big colonial fighting. There's some stuff happening before that in other German colonies, but this looks a bit different because this is big, this is international. It's a relief operation for the siege in particular at Beijing. There's also this famous statement by the British commander who says, Germans to the front. The big debate about why he said that is that because he thought the Germans are such great at military things. So this is when this relief operation is moving towards Beijing. Or is it because he wants to use the Germans and spare the British troops? Of course, in the German case, I know because they're the best soldiers in the world. And there is actually a painting of that which used to hang in every good German bourgeois household of the 19th century. And it says Germans to the front. So you can see it changes the German view, the German understanding of Germany as a world power. So that's important. And of course, if you put the negative spin on that, you have this speech that the emperor gives William II when the German troops embark to go to China. The famous Han speech, in which he says, well, just behave like the Han, kill everybody, give no quarter, and just be as awful as Attila and the Huns, and be so bad that in 1,000 years, no Chinese will even dare to look at a German with a funny eye. So that basically sums the whole thing up. Even the German press will say, oh my God, has he lost it now? And of course, that then goes forward into the First World War, sometimes even today, as to why some nations still call the Germans the Huns. But that's, again, a little bit of a rabbit hole, moving completely away from China for a brief moment, going to another country. But in the end, this uprising is then defeated. Because again, you put your boxes, fist and old techniques and old weapons against modern rifles and machine guns, and you can see what the outcome is going to be. And of course, as a consequence of that, you get an even tighter grip of all these nations on China. So you already mentioned some of these colonies. Well, we've got Hong Kong, we've got Tsingtao in the German case. These are still there. Some of these actually enlarged. They basically forced the Chinese to give them more territory. And the situation, you might argue, is looking even more dire for the Chinese after this uprising than before. So it looks as if China really is on this downward spiral from the 19th century into the 20th century. And it looks at that particular stage as if it's going to be a very, very bad century for China. Things, of course, are going to change, as we all know. But at that particular time, say around the turn of the century, it's not looking good. And looks as if China is completely, you might say, powerless and completely controlled by other nations. You might perhaps say a coalition of nations. So this coalition, as I say, the coalition of the 8 nations that fought in this Boxer uprising. So not a good time at the moment.
Right. And of course, for much of the 20th century, it doesn't get that much better for China. I mean, it takes decades for things to start changing. In any case, in case we've lost anyone out there, the Boxer uprising starts in the year 1900. Then there's these foreign powers, including Russia, the United States, and the European powers, even Austria-Hungary and Japan, who then send a force to intervene and basically relieve these sieges, as Matthias mentioned, in different places. In Tianjin, in Beijing, the western quarters have been besieged. And the Chinese imperial government, at first, the Boxers are fighting against them and they're fighting against the Boxers, but eventually they make common cause against the foreigners, but they're all defeated. So that's another interesting element to that uprising. So not only do the foreign powers intervene because they say, hey, these Boxers are harming our citizens who are there because we have unequal advantages, but still, they then are able to defeat Chinese government troops as well at the same time. So China's on its back. And one of the interesting aspects is Russia intervenes massively here in the region of Manchuria during this Boxer uprising. And the imperial government back in St. Petersburg, they decide, well, we're going to take advantage of the fact that, okay, there's an international intervention. That means we're not only going to march with everybody else towards Beijing from the south with a small contingent, but we're also going to intervene in Manchuria, which they do. And then they don't leave afterwards. That was supposed to be a part of the agreement after the Boxer uprising, but the Russians decide to stick around in Manchuria. It's an area that's rich in natural resources. It's an area that allows a lot of power projection into East Asia. And it's got some strategically important railways that the Russians are in control of. So they don't leave right away. This leads us into our next problem in the region, which is that in 1905, war breaks out between Japan and Russia. And you might be saying, listeners out there, but how's that part of the story of China? Well, it is because we have this intense competition now over decades, starting from, I guess, the 1880s, probably, although we could even say the 1860s when Russia gains this territory from China in the north. We have this competition centering around Manchuria and Korea. Some historians have even called this the Asian Great Game, because, of course, some of you may know out there that there's this idea of the Great Game between Russia and Britain in Afghanistan in the 19th century. That's kind of the buffer zone they're competing over with their imperial goals in Central and South Asia. Well, in East Asia, there was a kind of a great game going on as well between China, Japan, and Russia. In 1905, this boils over because the Japanese basically think, look, we can't tolerate that Russia has just decided to be in control, essentially, of Manchuria. This is not okay. The Russians are getting a bit more influence in Korea because of a whole bunch of complicated domestic political problems in Korea. One of the factions there turns to Russian support. That'll be for another rabbit hole another day. So Japan attacks Russia in 1904. There's the Russo-Japanese War that lasts till 1905, and the Japanese win. The Japanese win. And they are able to increase their control over Korea. They basically take control of Korea after this war. And they are able to increase the say that they have in Manchuria, because now they're getting some of those economic concessions, railway influence in Manchuria that the Russians had before. So that's how the Russo-Japanese War kind of also ties into this eventual conflict in World War II between China and Japan. I tried to keep that to a reasonable level of detail here, Matthias. Did I miss any little strings that we want to tie up?
If you really want to unpack this, well, again, as I said, we'd be here for 15 hours just trying to set the scene. We'd still be in 1869 something. It would be fun, but it would take forever. And it is a highly complex situation. I mean, every country, every continent is complex. I think most people in the West have a slightly better understanding of what happens, for example, in Europe. But we understand how complex that is. So unpacking all of this is really, really quite difficult. But as always, you've done it beautifully and perfectly. So brilliant. So there we are. I mean, if you bring it back and down to the pure military level for one moment, the Russo-Japanese War is absolutely fascinating. It's not really our area because in the end we should end up somewhere that resembles World War II, and we're still about 50 years away from it, or 40 years away from it. But there we go. But from a pure military point, it's really interesting because, as you said, the Japanese win. Well, that first of all sends shockwaves not only through Russia, but in a way through the whole Western world. Because here is an Asian nation, and they were regarded by most people, because this is the time of imperialism, also of racism. So you see, well, these are inferior to Westerners, to Europeans, to North Americans. So it sends shockwaves through the world, you might say, because the Japanese are able to defeat the Russian Navy in a very famous battle at Tsushima, 1905, but also the Russian army. The most famous action here is the siege of Port Arthur, a very, very important port, which the Japanese want to get their hands on, which eventually they also do. This is a fascinating point, not only in the relationship between these countries and also then the Chinese involvement, but generally speaking, when you look at what goes on there, because this is the first time in really in the 20th century that a modern war is being fought, and that means trenches, that means barbed wire, that means machine guns, that means artillery. And it's absolutely fascinating when you look at the reports from all the military observers that are sent there. All the European nations and the US, they send military observers there. Say, okay, what does that look like? Because this is the first really big war that is being fought, a bit like a continental European war since 1870-71. So they all go there and they look at this, and the reports that come back are basically analysis of the First World War. So they know exactly what the next war will look like for all sorts of reasons that we're not going to go into here, because that's for our sister podcast that looks at the First World War to discuss. They don't really adopt all these lessons, but you can see that everybody understands that the character of war has really, really changed, and we've now entered a new phase. And again, in the end, the Japanese are successful, and they win this war both on land and at sea, which is really, really, really shocking to the people at that particular time, you might say.
And the war is fought in large part in China. Port Arthur, it's dominated, controlled by the Russians first, then the Japanese after, then they're forced to give it up temporarily. It's in China. The big land battles like Mukden, for example, which is the older name for, I think the city is Shenyang in northern China. It's in China. And yet China is not an active participant in the war because it's not able to even exert its own control over its own territory. So you have this imperial struggle between Japan and Russia kind of over China lying down, essentially. And so this is another nail in the coffin, let's say, in hindsight anyway, of the old Chinese imperial system that's not able to modernize and not able to protect its own state and people. Which leads us to the next milestone here on our march towards the 1930s. China has a revolution in 1911. Different groups of people rise up against this old, corrupt, not able to modernize system, and the imperial system is overthrown. And a republic is declared in 1912. And perhaps the most prominent figure in this process, although it's very messy, is a guy called Sun Yat-sen. He's the leader of a political party that's trying to achieve a more modern China. It's a political party that becomes called the Kuomintang Party. Now we're talking World War II a little bit.
We're getting there. We're getting there.
KMT, right? So it's a party that views itself as Republican. It views itself as a kind of a revolutionary movement of some kind. They borrow some different ideas that come from Europe, like nationalism, like some leftist revolutionary ideas as well, some Marxist thinking, some socialist ideas. It's a bit of a mix. They end up evolving over time, but at the beginning, you have this very, very fragile Chinese republic, and the most prominent political force, let's say, is this Kuomintang party. However,
that would be too easy,
it
wouldn't
doesn't go well. That would be too easy. And then China was a democratic republic from now on. I'm afraid, folks, it ain't that easy, as probably most of you out there suspected, right? So you have this fragile republic created by the revolution, and within a couple of years, it descends into essentially a multi-party civil war that we usually refer to as the warlord period or warlordism. And this kind of lasts from the mid-teens until the mid or maybe late 1920s. Probably we can say it lasts, I guess, until 1928, probably around there. And during this period, there's no effective central government. You have different regional warlords or cliques, as they're called. So little shifting alliances between different warlords all across the country. You have a few big names, somebody who was president at first, called Wan Shikai. He plays a big role for years. But I don't want to get into too many of the names. It's a fascinating period. There are all sorts of rabbit holes in there. My favorite character from the warlord era is probably a guy called the Dog Meat General, who wrote terrible poems full of curse words about his warlord rivals. You have some Christian converts like the Christian warlord and all this kind of stuff. It's a fascinating period, but it's awful if you're a regular Chinese person because the country can't develop. The economy is in shambles. The foreign powers are still there with their concessions, still getting economic advantages, making deals with some of the warlords when it's convenient. The Japanese are making deals and supporting some of the cliques. Guess where? In Manchuria. So they are kind of partly influencing which warlords are in control in Manchuria. For the enthusiasts, the Fangtian clique is the one you want to know in Manchuria. But this is not a recipe for any kind of long-term development for China, success for China, and people are unhappy. And then they're unhappy also with the result of the First World War, because the main concern for China in the First World War is protecting themselves against Japan and potential Japanese future aggression. But they don't get territory back from the Japanese at the end of the war like they had hoped for. So there's a whole social movement that comes again in 1919. Lots of socialist ideas in this protest movement. So you can see that China during this warlord period is in a state of complete upheaval and still in a state of helplessness for the most part. Eventually, it starts to take shape in the later 1920s, but Matthias, I will leave a space for you to comment here before we move on, or even potentially, with an eye on time here, wrap up and save some of it for another episode.
We keep continuing this theme, don't we? It's not a good period for China. It really isn't, for all sorts of reasons that we've now looked at. It's if that's the right word, it's the dark ages of China in many ways. And as you said, it's the lack of a strong central government. Yes, the old imperial system is gone. However, you've got all these warlords. It's very difficult to organize a huge country like this. Would have been a challenge for everybody. Then put all sorts of the other issues and problems that we've mentioned now on top of this, and basically it becomes impossible. You still have these struggles with these other nations. Again, if we link it to Japan, as you said, not only do the Chinese not get any territories back, but actually some of the territories that other nations or one other nation had occupied and China has handed over to the Japanese. This is why Japan enters the First World War, declares war on Germany, and after the war's over, they get the former German colony of Tsingtao, so that becomes Japanese. So again, you can see how all this is now coming together. And then you look at the government itself. I mean, the government is really quite confused in many ways, because you've got these different factions here, and they form some sort of alliance. Probably is too strong a word, but they try to work together. And the groups that you get in there, I mean, it's quite amazing, because you got the Kuomintang. So basically, that's, for a better term, let's call them the nationalists, because that's also how they've been called as you move forward. And when we look at the 20s, 30s, and go into the 40s, that of course is one of the main groups there. But they form an alliance. They go together with the communists. So that's really quite amazing. They try to have some sort of governmental system that works. Of course, it doesn't. To make all this more established, to make it stronger, they're looking for outside support as well. Well, where do you go? Well, they turn towards the Soviet Union. And there's a Soviet delegation that comes down there that already promises to support China, whether it's politically or also in the case of war with weapons. And again, we'll talk about that later on. But you can already begin to see that's really quite interesting. So you've got a nationalist group here, which is actually in its outlook, in its DNA, very anti-communist, but they are now getting the support, and they're even sending people to Moscow, for example, to get trained in military matters. The most famous one of these, who goes there in 1923, is a chap called Chiang Kai-shek. And we will return to him, because he is one of the two key players in the story as we take the whole thing forward, particularly internally within China. And he's got nothing to do with or doesn't want anything to do with communists. He's going to fight a very long war against them. But here in 23, he goes to Moscow to be trained, and you might perhaps even better say educated at the Soviet academies, military academies. So you can see it is really quite a complex, a very confusing story that you find at this particular time in China.
Well, we hope, listeners, that we haven't confused you too badly.
I am confused
out there with our sweeping grand introduction to the Second World War in Asia that started in the 1850s or what have you. But essentially, if I want to boil it down here to reel all of us back in and set the stage for our next episode, China's in an awful period of decline and domination of foreign powers, not only from the so-called West, but also Russia and Japan. Much of this focuses on a struggle as well over Manchuria and Korea, that area. And China, by the early 1920s, which is approximately, I think, where we've ended up here for this episode, it's in this state of warlordism where the revolution has sort of failed to create stability. And you have this ongoing sort of civil war in which the Japanese are partly involved in the northeast. Japan, on the other hand, has a different second half of the 19th century. They have some of the same problems, but are more successful in their modernization movement. They win a couple of wars against China and Russia. And now, by the early 1920s, Japan is a formidable force in the region. They have imperial ambitions. In fact, in 1915, they have a whole list of demands that they put to China. We didn't mention that, but you can see the genesis of the imperial designs. Not only do they fear Russia, but they want dominance in China. And they do get some advantages by fighting on the Allied side in the First World War and gaining this German territory, for example. So you have a China that's still in a tough spot. You have a Japan that wants to expand at the expense of China, and is in a much stronger position in the 1920s. we will pick up the story of what happens with the Kuomintang and the Chinese communists and how that then really sets the stage for the lead up to the Second World War that we're a bit more familiar with in the next episode. So, thank you all for listening and watching. If you want to support our podcast and our confusing massive rabbit holes that we call a podcast, you can do that at bothsidesofthewire.com. You can even trial access to our exclusive content in the War Room if you wish. The code for that is Deep Dark Woods. In any case, we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. That's got to be some kind of record that we finish a whole episode and we're 20 years before the war began.
That is so very true. That is quite good. Oh my God. Yeah.